Today, Dick is going to be sort of a conversation partner. I will remind you that in no way has this been rehearsed. Dick read the same chapter that I'm basing um, the lesson on. Um, Unfortunately, Dick's not a guy with a lot of opinions, so I don't know how this is going to go. Um, he doesn't express them very much. So um, we'll see. If you haven't been here, I'll remind you that I am going through a series right now based on Martin Luther King Jr.'s book, Strength to Love. Um, uh, it's partially because recently, in response to a friend, they asked me for a recommendation of somebody to read, and I recommended Martin Luther King. And then I thought, oh, I should go back and read some more Martin Luther King Jr. And I had also been thinking a lot about living more intentionally. Had no idea any of this stuff was going to come up, that we'd be in quarantine, and the question of living intentionally would take on all kinds of additional meaning and importance. But picked up this book, started reading it, and was so inspired by it that I'm not in any way hiding how much these lessons are based on that book. So this week I was looking, I'm still trying to find stuff that's relevant to the situation that we're in, um, that's particularly relevant to the situation that we're in. And I found a chapter and almost skipped it because, as gifted as I think King is with a turn of phrase and with words, he's not always super gifted at naming his sermons. So this one was called Shattered Dreams, and so I almost skipped right over it. But I'm going to call it, which is a phrase I'm lifting from it, finite disappointments and infinite hope. So, King, and just to test the mic, Dick, are you with me?
I am.
All right, there he is.
Can you hear me?
I can. You got anything to say at this point?
No?
All right, everybody write
Keep
that
on
down.
going. There's going to be some good, I've looked at your notes already, so you got good stuff coming, so keep on going with them.
All right. As King starts off, he offers the Apostle Paul as an illustration of what he wants to talk about. He points out that in the letter to the Romans, Paul expresses a strong desire to go to Spain and to share the gospel, and how he hopes that he can stop and visit the Roman church, who he has this relationship with. Now, talking about that, King says, one of his ardent hopes was to travel to Spain, where, at the edge of the known world, he might further proclaim the Christian gospel. On his return, he wished to have personal fellowship with that valiant group of Roman Christians. The more he anticipated the privilege, the more his heart quickened with joy. His preparations now centered in carrying the gospel to the capital city of Rome and to Spain at the distant edge of the empire. What a glowing hope stirred within Paul's heart. But he never got to Rome, according to the pattern of his hopes. Because of his daring faith in Jesus Christ, he was indeed taken there, but as a prisoner, and was held captive in a little prison cell. Nor did he ever walk the dusty roads of Spain, nor look upon its curvaceous slopes, nor watch its busy coastal life. He was put to death, we presume, as a martyr for Christ in Rome. Paul's life is a tragic story of a shattered dream. But then he goes on, and King says, life mirrors many similar experiences. Who has not set out towards some distant Spain, some momentous goal, or some glorious realization, only to learn at last that he must settle for much less? We never walk as free men through the streets of our Rome. Instead, circumstances decree that we live within little confining cells. Written across our lives is a fatal flaw, and within history runs an irrational and unpredictable vein. Like Abraham, we too sojourn in the land of promise, but so often we do not become heirs with him of the same promise. Always our reach exceeds our grasp. Now, he's describing there kind of this situation of meeting disappointment, of even when we have faith in Christ, even when we're locking in on things that are good things, that are worthwhile things, that they don't always work out the way that we want to. And it's not just, some people, all of theirs work out, and then others sometimes. It's, no, if you're going to go after anything, there are going to be times when it doesn't work, when it was good, when you had the right motivations, where you did all the prep work that you should have done, and for whatever reason, this time it doesn't go like you thought, because there are things that are beyond your control, because other people are making choices. And that's a common experience. And right there in the life of the guy who ends up writing most of the New Testament, you see this great, his desire to go to Spain and proclaim the gospel, his desire to visit and have fellowship with this church that he's watched grow, that he cares so much about. There's nothing wrong with those. Those aren't wrong-headed goals, but they don't go that way. And then King says, before we determine how to live in a world where our highest hopes are not satisfied, we must ask, what does one do under such circumstances? Now, he's going to suggest some common responses, and I am going to remember that I have slides. He's going to suggest some common responses, but before we get to the common responses that he suggests, Dick, do you have anything to add at this point?
Yes, I do. In your opening remarks, one of the things you talked about was intentional living, that a lot of your sermons that you're looking at and thinking about deal with the fact that we need to be living intentionally. And one of the things that I think is going to always happen, I don't think it can be a living, you plan. You begin to have dreams of where you want to go or where you want to take your life, you want to be involved in. And that's why I think today's lesson is such a good one on that, because what it means is sometimes you're going to set your sights on something that God's going to say no to. Sometimes you're going to set your sights on something where somebody else says no to. Something will interfere with it and you'll never accomplish that goal. But if you're going to live intentionally, you have to have those, and therefore you're going to have disappointment somewhere along the route.
Yeah, it's kind of a guarantee.
Absolutely.
And part of that comes from going after anything. And well, I'm going to get into his responses, and that's going to cover some of what I almost just got ahead of myself and said. But yeah, that's a beautiful segue into what he's talking about. First common reaction, and again, let me remember that I have slides to show you. The first common reaction he says people have is bitterness and resentment. He says one possible reaction is to distill all of our frustrations into a core of bitterness and resentment. The person who pursues this path is likely to develop a callous attitude, a cold heart, and a bitter hatred towards God, towards those with whom he lives, and toward himself. Because he cannot corner God or life, he releases his pent-up vindictiveness and hostility towards other people. He may be extremely cruel to his mate and inhuman to his children. In short, meanness becomes his dominating characteristic. He loves no one and requires love from no one. He trusts no one and does not expect others to trust him. He finds fault in everything and everybody, and he continually complains. Such a reaction poisons the soul and scars the personality, always harming the person who harbors this feeling more than anyone else. So he says, okay, one thing that might happen is you got somebody who goes after a goal. It's a good goal. It's a worthwhile goal. They pour themselves into it and they face disappointment. They run into frustration, and because that hurts, because they want to protect themselves from that kind of pain, they sort of lash back out, and the way it exhibits itself is in sort of this meanness and cruelty. They let it, they kind of ruminate on the disappointment until it ferments into this bitterness and resentment. They don't start out that way. Nobody decides, hey, you know what I want to be? You know what I think my best life path is? Bitterness and resentment. That's not a choice anybody makes. It's the byproduct of a way of reacting to this kind of disappointment. Dick, you have anything you want to say?
As most of y'all know, I can't help but read stuff without thinking about movies that I've seen. And on this whole lesson today, one of the movies that keeps going through my head is Jimmy Stewart's It's a Wonderful Life. That movie is a story about how he had all these dreams of travel, and the moment he winds up getting married, instead of being able to travel, he has to spend all his money to help keep his business afloat. And his entire life winds up being one impediment after another to what he thought was going to be his next big step and next big thing that he was going to do. But in that movie, the old guy that owns them has all the money. He's a bitter, angry old guy that no amount of money, no amount of having everything really makes him happy. And yet that's what his entire life is all about. He wants to take over everything. He wants it to even be named Pottersville in the end, if he could. And so his reaction to life and probably disappointment somewhere along his way in that story is he becomes one of the meanest, ordinariest folks in all of movie history.
That's true. It's funny because when Dana and I were talking about this earlier, and I'm putting together sermon slides that I didn't even know if you guys were going to be able to see, and I'm putting way too much thought into them. We're trying to figure out one, and she actually brought up "It's a Wonderful Life." I didn't wind up using it because I actually thought I'm putting way too much time into this, and I'm just going to do text for. You'll have pictures for like the first 2 slides, and then I'm like text. But that actually is one of the ones that came up. He goes on and he says, and let me advance the slide. And if you got, I did send out files. This is one of the files that I sent out. If you're not seeing this well, they were printed out. Okay, the next one he says is withdrawal. King says, another common reaction by persons experiencing the blighting of hope is to withdraw completely into themselves. No one is permitted to enter into their lives, and they refuse to enter into the lives of others. Such persons give up on the struggle of life, lose their zest for living, and attempt to escape by lifting their minds to a transcendent realm of cold indifference. Detachment is the word which best describes them. Too unconcerned to love and too passionless to hate, too detached to be selfish and too lifeless to be unselfish, too indifferent to experience joy and too cold to experience sorrow. They are neither dead nor alive, they merely exist. So King says, okay, here's another reaction that some people have, that instead of lashing out in meanness, and maybe it's personality or for whatever reason, instead of just lashing out in meanness, they just stop engaging. They hold everybody at arm's length. There's nothing really of any kind of depth, because if you don't risk attachment, if you don't risk relationship with people, then you don't have to worry about getting hurt by people. You weren't expecting anything to start with. They don't risk anything intense like passion or sorrow because they're just afraid of it. And so they withdraw from life, they escape, and that's it. I don't like it, but I think he describes it really well at the end, where he says, they are neither dead nor alive, they just exist. They reduce themselves to merely existing. It's really almost, in some ways, a form of cynicism. They just won't risk anything on the adventure of life anymore. Now, again, nobody sets out that way. I'm not just talking about whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. That's not what he's talking about here. This is somebody. It's not that they make a decision about their life. I am. You know what kind of life I want? I want a life that's detached from everyone and anything that means anything. Anything that might be important, anything that might elicit path. Nobody picks that path intentionally. It's a way of reaction. And usually if you explore it, it's a way of reaction from somebody who's been hurt, who's been burned, who's been betrayed in some way. And this is their sort of reactive way of trying to protect themselves, of trying to protect their heart. But again, like we talked about before, in their move of trying to avoid losing anything, they lose everything that matters. Dick?
Adam, I think what worries me is in church, this one is probably the one that we see the most. And I want to hear your opinion on it here in a moment, because to me, it's the one we see where people begin to, they kind of stop singing. Their attendance becomes spotty. They begin to just kind of fade away, and before you know it, they're gone. That there's just a withdrawal, and I'm not sure that as a church we pick up on that sometimes as soon as we should.
Yeah, I think that that tends to be such a it tends to be such a slow process. Like I don't think that you say, all right, my reaction is withdrawal, and so this day I was super engaged, and the next day totally withdrawn. I think it's the slow burn that kind of happens, and because unfortunately, um, in leadership, in groups, and that kind of thing, well, and really just in interpersonal life, if we don't watch it, we wind up just sort of reacting and putting out fires. And so, wait, here's the big squeaky wheel. We got to go oil the big squeaky wheel, and you miss as somebody just slowly is not quite as engaged. And you think maybe, okay, well, they're having an off day or an off week. If you even notice, because you're trying to deal with all the fires and stuff. Um, and, and and even when I'm talking in the beginning of pretty much every lesson in this, talking about intentional living, that's one of the things looking at sort of my own personal life and my life with the church that I want to address, because if we're not intentional about those kind of things, you do wind up just reacting to whatever the brightest light is and the biggest explosion is, and where the fire is, instead of saying, all right, what is it we want to do and how is it that we want to be engaged? And if you're not looking for it, you miss it in other people. If you're not looking for it, frankly, I think you miss it in yourself too. Um, would you say anything else to that?
No, go ahead and go on with your next slide.
All right. Let's find it. There we go. All right. His third one, he says, and this is probably not a word you use every day. Well, it may be a word Dick uses, but nobody else. He says fatalism. King says, a third way by which persons respond to disappointments in life is to adopt a fatalistic philosophy, stipulating that whatever happens must happen, and that all events are determined by necessity. Fatalism implies that everything is foreordained and inescapable. Because they believe that man has no freedom, they seek neither to deliberate nor to make decisions, but rather they wait passively for external forces to decide for them. All right, let's stop there. I've got some more from what he's saying, but let's pause there for just a second, because I got to tell you, I have found myself at times. Now, I would debate the philosophy all day long, but I found myself at times when I wasn't being very intentional, landing uncomfortably close to what he describes there at the end. That idea of, and I would argue all day long with somebody who said man has no freedom, but the last part, rather they wait passively for external forces to decide for them. If I'm really honest, there have been times where if I looked at what I was doing, I go, oh, wow, I don't like that at all, but that looks like what I'm doing. I'm just kind of waiting this thing out. And then we'll react to whatever happens, but that's not living intentionally. Dick, would you add anything, not particularly about me, unless you want to, but
Well, I think it's I don't know if it's becoming more and more prevalent in our society. Again, I think any good Calvinist falls into this probably segment, this third segment, the idea that, well, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Nothing I can do, and so you wind up feeling like nothing that you do matters. And what's really bad is I've watched people's eyes. It gets to the point where they begin to think they don't matter.
right.
And that's not a good place for folks to land.
Exactly. I thought about that same thing when I was reading through this. King goes on and says, to sink in the quicksand of fatalism is both intellectually and psychologically stifling. Because freedom is a part of the essence of man, the fatalist, by denying freedom, becomes a puppet, not a person. He is, of course, right in his conviction that there is no absolute freedom and that freedom always operates within the context of predetermined structure. Common experience teaches us that a man is free to go north from Atlanta to Washington or south from Atlanta to Miami, but north to Miami or south to Washington, but not north to Miami nor south to Washington. Freedom is always within the framework of destiny, but there is freedom. We are both free and destined. Even though destiny might prevent our going to some attractive Spain, we do have the capacity to accept such a disappointment, to respond to it, and to do something about the disappointment itself. But fatalism stymies the individual, leaving him helplessly inadequate for life. So he actually goes and wrestles between this, and I think in some ways even makes space for the Calvinist. And even though I'm not a Calvinist, I can see him sort of making space for them there, um, where he talks about, okay, when we say that there's freedom, there's not absolute freedom. You couldn't just, decide to walk out in your backyard and fly or something. You can't go south from Atlanta to Washington or north from Atlanta to Miami. I mean, there's a structure there that you have to operate within, but you do have legitimate choice and freedom within that. And to act as if everything is just sort of predetermined and then just sort of react to whatever happens is not um, living intentionally. Do you have anything else you would say about that tension between sort of freedom and what he calls destiny, or sort of the structure of reality, or whatever, or anything else you want to talk about, Dick?
Not without getting ahead of the lesson. I'm sorry.
Good man. All right. One more thing about from King on this. He says, fatalism, furthermore, is based on a. Let me start that over. Fatalism, furthermore, is based on an appalling conception of God. For everything, whether good or evil, is considered to represent the will of God. A healthy religion rises above the idea that God wills evil. Although God permits evil in order to preserve the freedom of man, he does not cause evil. That which is willed is intended. And the thought that God intends for a child to be born blind or for a man to suffer the ravages of insanity is sheer heresy that pictures God as a devil rather than a loving father. All right. So, Dick, I'll let you take lead on that. You respond to that.
It catch me off guard in that well, again, one of the neat things, okay, that strikes me as we go through the this mechanism for seeing each other and having a church meeting is the level of participation. I really do appreciate the fact that there are so many different pictures on my screen this morning. Last week, the fact that there were so many different pictures on the screen. It's nice to be part of a group that, in spite of all the bad things that are going on, I mean, the country is shutting down, people are dying, some folks are being without work, others are being overworked. It's a really strange time in our country as far as beginning to feel tired, as far as beginning to feel like we're all in little cells, like Paul described at the in the opening paragraphs here of what it is to be like in jail. This self quarantine has a sense of being in jail in a way. And yet we're provided with a blessing that allows us to see each other, to spend time with each other a little bit, to not only see each other in church, but we're seeing each other in our homes. We're seeing each other outside. We're getting to see each other, all sorts of different things, and it's an antidote for this fatalist attitude of nothing matters, nothing's going to work, it's all going to be bad. We all wind up being Eeyores if we're not careful. And something like this morning's get together, I think speaks to the opposite of that. And it says we are going to come out of this. We are going to be okay. We are going to find these ways to connect.
It's funny that in the midst of all this, okay, last week we did this for the first time, and it was very much an experiment. I had never done anything like this. Most people, I think a few of the teachers had already been messing with the Zoom platform and that kind of thing. But afterwards, the feedback that we got from people, like unsolicited, was how meaningful it was, and how surprised they were at how meaningful it was, to be able to interact, to see the little faces on the screen at the same time, to show up. Um, and honestly, I had looked for a platform where that was possible, and was surprised to find one that works to this degree. Um, but the way that people responded to that was beyond anything that I was even hoping for, because it really mattered to them. Um, and in our little quarantine in our little house, um, Dana, it keeps going after these ideas of, okay, here's the cards we're dealt. Here's what we can't do. Now, how can we connect with people? How can we bring hope to people anyway in that environment? And it's just so much this beautifully creative, I guess I would say, rebellion in a way, where you sort of, if you understand my meaning, it's sort of a rage against the dying of the light kind of thing. That you're saying, no, we're not just going to give in to this is the way things are. We're going to find these other, paths. We're going to find ways, to breathe life into each other anyway. But again, nobody, I think, decides, you know what, I want to be a fatalist. I would like to just decide that everything's predetermined and that it really doesn't matter what I do. I think that will bring about the best life for me. Nobody does that. It's something that you sort of slide into. Okay, the board for the game changed. The rules of the game changed. It's temporary. It doesn't feel temporary sometimes. It's temporary. So how do we play now? How do we live intentionally if the board looks like this? And frankly, and I'm sure that you have people in your life who are doing this for you too, or maybe you are that person. Dana, for me, is inspiring in the way that she goes after that, and it's really kind of beautiful. But I think that if you don't, then you slide into one of these three things, and very often it's fatalism or withdrawal, just because of the disappointment of the thing shifting on you. You understand what I'm saying? Here's how I thought it worked, and it shifts on me, and I don't know what to do. And so you can sort of cocoon in on yourself. You can sort of just be paralyzed by that. And whatever you try to protect there evaporates, because you're not going after anything. In any of these scenarios, you're not going after anything. Um, Anything else before I move, Dick?
No, sir. Let's roll on.
Rolling on. All right, so let's move into seeking an answer, and we're gonna use some Bible if you're into that. King says, "What then is the answer? The answer lies in our willing acceptance of unwanted and unfortunate circumstances, even as we still cling to a radiant hope. Our acceptance of finite disappointments, even as we adhere to infinite hope. Place your failure at the forefront of your mind and stare daringly at it. Ask yourself, how may I, confined in some narrow Roman cell and unable to reach life's Spain, transmute this dungeon of shame into a haven of redemptive suffering?" And he brought up Paul, so I want to take us to Paul in Romans chapter 8, starting in verse 26. Romans chapter 8, starting in verse 26. Paul says, "In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes." Okay, Dick, do you have that scripture open?
I do.
Okay, I'm going to go get my power cord that I forgot to plug in because my computer's yelling at me that my battery's about to die. Could you finish reading that text, 26 through 28, while I plug in?
Sure. Okay, y'all, I'm going to pick it up with, again, he's talking about the Holy Spirit, that when we don't have words, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. And we know that, and this is trite sometimes, but it's what's on the slides in front of us, so you know where I'm going. And that is the will of God. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. and who've been called according to his purpose. That again, it's a scripture that sometimes gets used, I think, a little bit wrong about every single thing that happens is what God intended and it's good. No, some things are bad. Sometimes things are just lousy. Sometimes death, destruction. In the middle of the coronavirus, if you're in Jonesboro, Arkansas, you're waking up this morning to having tornadoes come through on top of everything else. And is that God's will that all that destruction and disease winds up happening to you? And the answer is God allows it. And we can be better for it on the other side. But it's not that every single thing that happens is a good thing in the world. It's not. Some things are bad. And for those of us who trust in God, what we do is it's trite, but it's the making lemonade out of lemons. Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I wanted to go with that. There's a way that if you just lifted that last verse out of Romans and didn't give it any context, you could almost make it sound like it supports the kind of fatalism that King was talking about before. But there is a context. There's a context of Paul's life. There's a context of Romans. There's a context of Romans chapter 8 beyond even what we read. There's this idea of, okay, here's the deal. God is so engaged. God is so for us that he's not like some kind of cosmic mob boss who's looking for you to say exactly the right prayer to get him to do you a favor because you said the right words or something. This God has taken up residence inside of you with his spirit. He knows your heart, and he knows what to pray for even when you don't have the words, meaning this God is so invested. He searches your heart, and rather than needing you to come up with just the right words and just the right way to say it, this God provides the prayer to himself because it's not transactional. It's a God that's invested. So part of it, I think, is knowing that you're not alone. You're not abandoned by God, even in a Roman cell or quarantined to your house. God's still involved. God's still invested. God's still taking the story somewhere, even in the middle of disappointments, even when things aren't working exactly the way that you thought they would, and the way that you thought they would was a good way. God's still there. God's still at work. God's still invested. And so it is the distinction between not, hey, God's got stuff that he wants to do, and he's willing to go to any means necessary to get it. So if that means he's got to do a lot of evil to bring some good about, then that's what he's going to do. No, that's a misunderstanding of God. I agree with King. That's heresy. God is able to work within the situations with whatever good or evil happens to bring about good in your life. God is not, it's not that God is so limited as to have one set path. That's the only way things that work. God is so all-knowing and so all-powerful that whatever happens within the realm of choice, God's able to use it to work for his purposes. King says this, almost anything that happens to us may be woven into the purposes of God. It may lengthen the cords of our sympathy. It may break our self-centered pride. The cross, which was willed by wicked men, was woven by God into the tapestry of world redemption. So part of the first part of the answer is understanding that this isn't a distant God. This isn't an unfeeling, uncaring God. This isn't a God who just abandons us. This is a God who is engaged and invested, is wiser than we are, knows more than we do. And we're trying to choose the good, realizing that we're not in it alone, that God hasn't abandoned us. He hasn't given up on us, and he's still taking the story somewhere. It's still going somewhere good. And he's able to bring good about even out of suffering, even out of pain. Dick, before I move on, you got anything else you want to add?
I just want to set up the next one in that as I look at the next slide, geography and history. And that is, Paul has been commissioned by God to be the apostle to the Gentiles. And so if God has talked to you on the road to Damascus and God has made you the apostle to the Gentiles, and you look around what you know of as the known world, and you think, okay, I've only stayed here on the Eastern Mediterranean. I need to be preaching to the entire world. I need to get out. And Spain had been a part of the Roman Empire at this point for 100 years. It was well integrated. It wasn't the frontier. This was a normal part. There were Gentiles there. There were folks who needed to hear. And so Paul says, I plan on going to Spain. I'm going to make the entire route of this Mediterranean Sea and get to everybody and teach them about Jesus.
All right, so walking into this part, King says, how familiar is the experience of longing for Spain and settling for a Roman prison? And how less familiar the transforming of the broken remains of a disappointed expectation into opportunities to serve God's purpose. Yet powerful living always involves such victories over one's own situation. If you have that in the notes, I think I mistyped part of that. So look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13 through 16. And the Hebrew writer points out something here. I don't know that's something that we look at very much. It's not, in some ways, the best sales pitch, but it's something that's deeply true. And it's something that's deeply, I think, important for those of us who would have faith, trust, hope, confidence in God. Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 13. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. The Hebrew writer points out that there are all these people in the story of the faith, there are all these people that they knew of that might not have even made scripture, who were living in this time, this in-between time, the already but not yet, where God has made promises, where there's good in the world, but there's still evil and bad and difficult things unfolding in the world. We're moving towards a story, the end of the story, where God makes all things right and there's some kind of new beginning. But we live in this, okay, some of the promises have come true, some of them are still out there, and we're facing disappointment. And some of us, like many of them, are going to, well, like all of the people I'm pointing at, are going to not see them fully come to fruition. Believing that they will, believing that the good that we do now builds into that, pours into that, but we may not see all of the good that comes about it. We may not see it come to completion until one day when God makes it possible, because that is part of our beliefs, that everybody that God made promises to will someday be around to see them fulfilled. That's the hope of resurrection. That's the hope of life beyond life. That's the idea that God made promises to all of these people. They died before they saw them come to fruition, but God is able to even raise them up from death so that they can live without the threat of decay in the fulfilled promises of God. That's the idea. That's part of the story. And so King says, we must accept finite disappointment, but we must never lose infinite hope. Only in this way shall we live without the fatigue of bitterness and the drain of resentment. That hope is the antidote, that trust is the antidote, that faith in that way is the antidote to this kind of bitterness. And I love the way that he phrases that, the fatigue of bitterness and the drain of resentment. Bitterness is exhausting, isn't it? You've been there. Bitterness wears you out. It feels like, if it doesn't feel like that's what it's going to do, but it's what it does. And the drain of resentment, holding on to resentment actually doesn't really diminish the other person that much, not nearly so much as it diminishes you. Dick, you want to add anything?
No, we're nearly to the good part. Let's go.
Let's go. King says, our refusal to be stopped, our courage to be, our determination to go on in spite of, reveal the divine image within us. The man who has made this discovery knows that no burden can overwhelm him, and no wind of adversity can blow his hopes away. He can stand anything that can happen to him. Certainly, the Apostle Paul possessed this type of courage to be. His life was a continual round of disappointments. Did he permit these conditions to master him? And then, by way of answering, I wanted to go to Philippians chapter 4, starting in verse 10. Did Paul permit these conditions to master him? Philippians 4, starting verse 10. This is Paul talking. I rejoiced greatly in the Lord the last time you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. Now, again, you talk about verses that are misused, and I don't know that I'll go that far with this, but again, if you just listen to popular culture, you would think that this was a verse that Paul wrote for sports teams to chant together before games. I don't know that that's not under the umbrella of what he's talking about, but it would only be sort of a sliver because he's talking about something much, much bigger, especially when he's referencing back to his own life. He's talking about this idea of, look, life's going to throw some stuff at you. There are going to be times where you're suffering. There's going to be times when you face disappointment, when you thought something was good, was exactly what you needed to do, and you pour yourself into it, and the game shifts on you. The thing shifts on you. The board changes, and you've got to figure out what to do. You've got to roll with it. And so he says, I have learned the secret to being content. Now, I need to be super clear. This is Paul talking, and I think he had it down more than I do most of the time. But he says, here's the secret to being content. Plenty or want, hungry or well-fed, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That there's this sense, and one of the devastating things about disappointment is that disappointment almost always feels permanent when you're in the middle of it, doesn't it? That disappointment is that's one of the sort of dangerous things about most forms of depression is that they feel permanent when you're in the middle of it. You can know that's not the way that it works. You can know, well, I've been through depression before. You can know, well, the chemicals change, but it feels permanent. And that's what's so scary about it. Disappointment feels permanent. That's why you move into those protective phases that he talks about before, because it feels permanent. It feels like it's the only thing that's ever going to happen. And Paul says, look, here's the deal. I know that I'm not alone in this. I know that God has invested in me so much that he's even providing the prayers to himself. He's not looking for me to even say the right thing. I know that God is taking the story somewhere good, even if I can't see it at times. I'm going to put my trust, my hope, and faith in him. I know that I can do all things through Christ because in him, in the God who will even bring me back from the dead one day and free me from my imprisonment to decay so that I can live in his fulfilled promises, that any suffering that I face is temporary. That there's at least that card to play, that we still got that ace in our hand, that okay, it doesn't matter what you throw at us. In the end, love, in the end, hope, in the end, faith is what wins out, is what's realized. In the end, the good that I did that was in line with the kingdom of God, that's the stuff that mattered, that's the stuff that was forever. Dick, you want to add something?
I would like everyone to kind of think about that in their lives right now. A couple of things. One is this time in our country and our locally in our area and even within our church, some folks are going to have a hard time making it. That the financial shutdown that's going to come is going to reverberate for weeks, months, and who knows how long. As far as money and jobs and businesses closing or having to go to reduced hours or whatever. Um, and we need to be sensitive to that. But at the same time, everybody, I think, needs to probably take a moment or two and maybe like while we're doing Communion Day or something, think about those big things that are going right in your life. Think about those things that, your family. Um, Again, we've got so many things to be thankful for and to recognize that the big things are coming together okay. Um, and that's probably where we need to spend our time, not worrying about some of the things that are of lesser importance that are really heading downhill right now pretty badly. Adam, back to you. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Um, let's finish up. Let's finish up here. What Paul starts to lean into and what King picks up on is this idea of peace. That contentment that he's talking about is another form of being at peace in the world, and in a world that sometimes it seems completely upside down. Um, but he goes ahead and makes a distinction. King says this. He says, peace as the world commonly understands it comes when the summer sky is clear and the sun shines in scintillating beauty, when the pocketbook is full, when the mind and the body are free of ache and pain, and when the shores of Spain have been reached. But this is not true peace. The peace of which Paul spoke is a calmness of soul amidst terror of trouble, inner tranquility amidst the howl and rage of the outer storm, the serene quiet at the center of a hurricane amid the howling and jostling winds. We readily understand the meaning of peace when everything is going right and when one is up and in, but we are baffled when Paul speaks of that true peace which comes when a man is down and out, when burdens lie heavy upon his shoulders, when pain throbs annoyingly in his body, when he is confined by the stone walls of a prison cell, and when disappointment is inescapably real. True peace, a calm that exceeds all description and all explanation, is a peace amidst storm and tranquility amid disaster. So, leaning into Paul, if we backed up in that Philippians passage, you'll see kind of some of the context of what he was talking about. Paul in Philippians 4, starting verse 4, says, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. And I'll just pause and say again, if I just read that devoid of any context, that is a bizarre commandment. It is you driving on the vacation with your kids fighting in the back seat, and you turning around to them and saying, you will be happy and have fun now, which has not ever worked in the history of the world, because it's not something you can command. But that's why you need to hang with Paul and see what he's saying. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything. Again, by itself, not terribly helpful as a command. Hey, don't worry. Thanks. Needed that. But that's not all he's doing. Listen to what he says. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. So Paul says, you've got to be able to find joy in any situation. You've got to not let anxiety take you over, because it could, because there are things to be anxious about. There are things to be afraid of. There are things that will steal your joy. So what do we do? Well, Paul says, okay, start with this one. The Lord's near. Take a second and just remember, because there are going to be times when God feels distant, particularly when you're closed off in a prison cell like Paul, or when you're closed off just in quarantine these days. it's going to feel like everybody is distant. That's why things like this are so important. Looking at a bunch of little boxes with people's faces in them, that's why it's so important right now. The Lord, these people in a way are near, and it's going to feel like even God is far away, but you got to remember the Lord is near. You aren't abandoned. You aren't alone. God isn't taking a break. He says, don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. He says, okay, don't be anxious, but instead of being anxious, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God. Look, I harp on gratefulness. I'm not going to stop. But right now, gratitude and actually practicing gratitude for yourself and with your family is incredibly important, because there's going to be a pull towards these things we were talking about at the beginning of the sermon, towards these other states of withdrawal, of bitterness and resentment, um, and you can fight it. You're supposed to fight it, but you have to cultivate gratitude. You have to set your eyes, put on the lens of gratitude so that you see, because when you're looking for the things to be grateful for, you'll find them. You'll find them. They're there. And if you're not looking for them, you'll forget them. And the people, if you're fortunate enough to be quarantined with people that you love, you need to be reminding yourself of all the reasons to be grateful for them. You need to be reminding yourself of the good, because left to its own devices, there's going to be lots of opportunity to be annoyed. I know I am annoying if you're around me for long periods of time, or maybe short periods of time. Um, there's going to be plenty, and I get annoyed. I get annoyed at stuff that's not a big deal at all. If I'm not living on purpose, that can creep in. If I'm irritated about something else, I can get irritated with things that aren't even irritating. I know none of you are like this, but I guess it's confessional. He says, okay, present your request to God. Instead of being anxious, present your request to God with thanksgiving. Thanksgiving provides the context of a God who's already gifted you with all of these good things, who's already showed up in your life. So of course you would want to bring it to him. That's the context for these petitions. And then he says, and if you do that, the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will be with you. You've heard of peace that passes understanding. I think the thing that we don't really pump the brakes on, because it's a beautiful turn of phrase, is what that implies is that understanding is not guaranteed. It's not that you're getting peace because now you understand. It's that God grants you a peace in the middle of this, even if you don't. Even if it doesn't make sense, even if the world shifted on you and it doesn't make sense, God is providing you with peace. Jesus even says at one point, my peace I give you. And then he says, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. If you want to live intentionally, and I'm speaking to myself as much as anybody, you're going to have to decide to dwell on those things. It's not that the other things don't exist. It's not that you are ignoring them. You'll still see them. You'll still interact with them, but you'll be better equipped for the life that you're living in. You'll be better equipped when you are focusing on whatever is pure and lovely and admirable, anything that's excellent or praiseworthy. And the people around you, the people that you're closest to, they're experiencing the same kind of pull. They're experiencing the same kind of draw. They're experiencing the same kind of feeling trapped, feeling disappointment, feeling whatever. And what they need from you, as much as you need it from them, is to be lifted up, is to be told what's excellent and praiseworthy, is to find hope. And sometimes we need life and hope breathed into us. And the people around us need that from us as well. Dick, you got anything you want to add?
No, go ahead and close us on out.
Okay. King, we'll close the way that King deals with it. King says, our capacity to deal creatively with shattered dreams is ultimately determined by our faith in God. Genuine faith imbues us with the conviction that beyond time is a divine spirit and beyond life is life. However dismal and catastrophic may be the present circumstances, we know that we are not alone, for God dwells with us in life's most confining and oppressive cells. And even if we die there without having received the earthly promises, he shall lead us down that mysterious road called death, and at last to that indescribable city he has prepared for us. His creative power is not exhausted by this earthly life, nor his majestic love locked within the limited walls of time and space. Would not this be a strangely irrational universe if God did not ultimately join virtue and fulfillment, and an absurdity and an absurdly meaningless universe if death were a blind alley leading the human race into a state of nothingness? God, through Christ, has taken the sting of death from. Hold on just a second. I think somebody's coming through. God, through Christ, has taken the sting of death by freeing us from its dominion. Our earthly life is a prelude to a glorious new awakening, and death is an open door that leads us into a life eternal. The Christian faith makes it possible for us nobly to accept that which cannot be changed, to meet disappointment and sorrow with an inner poise, and to absorb the most intense pain without abandoning our sense of hope. For we know, as Paul testifies, in life or in death, in Spain or in Rome, that all things work together for good to those that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. So, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. And everyone said together, amen.